take a moment and bow your heads and join me in prayer. Loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Well, I imagine for any of you who ever grew up having stories read to you as a child, or maybe reading them to your children or grandchildren, you know that all great stories begin with what line?
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time. Our scripture doesn't exactly start like that, but it could. Once upon a time, there was a beginning to all of time and creation. And just like things have a beginning, they also have an ending. At some point in the future, there will be an ending, a culmination of God's purpose in his creation. But what happens between the beginning and the end? Normally a bunch of stuff, right? Things that keep us on the edge, that make us want to turn the page. Other times we want to close the book and put it down, don't we? Because we're afraid to know what happens next. Well, life's not really all that different. There are many different kinds of moments in the in-between. At any moment, at any given time in our world, we're living in that in-between time, aren't we? And we know that at any given moment, there's probably someone celebrating. And while someone celebrates, there's someone else who's upset, mourning. We have those who laugh, while others have had such a bad day they can't even find laughter. We know that there's probably someone yelling and shouting in joy, while someone else is maybe whispering. At any given moment, there may be someone being lifted up and nurtured by a community, and at other times there may be someone who's being torn down. At any given moment, there may be someone rejoicing. There could be mourning. There could be a moment of someone finding something or someone losing something. And we can probably tell, based on our population, at any given moment, there's probably births occurring across our world. And at the same time, there are also people exiting this world through death. We come today in our scripture at a very specific point, at a time between life and death for Jesus. We know the cross is really not that far away. And in this in-between time, Jesus deliberately prolongs it. Doesn't he?
Yeah.
In a moment where there are tears, where there is hope, where some are full of belief, some unbelief, and others full of criticism. It's a moment in which people are waiting between death and resurrection. It's a moment which teaches us as God's people in the here and now about what happens in that moment between the beginning and the end, in those in-between times. As John's Gospel goes, we know that Lazarus, his close friend, has been very ill. And when Jesus heard of his illness through the other friends, Mary, Martha, Lazarus' two sisters, he didn't rush to Lazarus' side like we would expect. It says that Jesus waited 2 days, and then he traveled to Bethany. And by the time he arrived, we know that Lazarus had been dead and in the tomb for 4 days. Following Jewish custom, he had probably been treated with spices and oils and wrapped in linen. His family had engaged in the Jewish tradition of beginning the mourning process, which was to last for approximately 23 days, the first 7 being intense mourning. And we all know that people act differently when they're in grief and in mourning. And if you catch in Scripture, Mary stays home in her grief, but Martha runs on ahead because she hears that Jesus is coming. But they both have the same question when they see Jesus, don't they? Lord, if you had been here, they say, my brother would not have died. felt somewhat ignored, probably. Their problem was not with a lack of faith. For both women believed Jesus, right? That's obvious in what they said. If you had been here, he would have been raised from the dead, or he wouldn't have died. Their problem was that he waited so long and didn't show up on their time, which is also an important lesson, I think, for us today, right? We don't always understand God's timing.
Amen.
We don't know why God does things the way God does them. And we're never going to know that. There are many ways, with that in mind, we could look at the story. But today, I'm going to lift up 3 things that we can do in those in-between times in our life. We know from the way in which we've experienced the world and experienced life together as a Christian family that there are many good things, right? Times of celebration and joy. But just as we have that, we also have the opposite. Moments of deep pain, places we see brokenness in the world. But we know that there's a promise that one day all things will be made right again. All things will be made whole. But until that day, we live in those in-between times. And we wait for our hopes to be fulfilled. We wait for those things of our past that have caused us pain to be healed. We wait for our humanness not to be in the way. For these things and all those other things we could wait for, we have to call them an in-between time and wait. But in our waiting, just as that community was doing in John's Gospel around Lazarus and waiting for Jesus, we know that they did at least one thing. They began to weep, right? No matter how confident we are of God's promises and how strong our hope is in God and knowing that those promises will be made true, God himself was still moved to tears. In fact, God was moved to tears in an in-between time. Not just over his friend Lazarus, but in a time in which he had sent his son by choice. A time between life and death. A time in which he asked him to take on full humanness and experience great pain, suffering, and death. I don't know about you, but that's something to have hope around. Something that can give peace. In fact, that pain and suffering that Jesus experienced is so powerful in the Greek, I wish our Bible had been translated a little differently. If you read it in the Greek, it says that Jesus was deeply moved to the point that he groaned violently, and his core shook. We feel that, don't we, as humans? There have been moments we've groaned violently, that we've been shaking in our core. And sometimes I think the world tries to teach us that weeping is a sign of lacking, right? Don't cry, don't show that you're weak. Some people will even say if you cry about certain things, that means you have a lack of faith. But I'm here to say that weeping is not a sign of weakness.
Amen.
It doesn't mean that you lack anything in your faith. Think about it like this. Mary and Martha and God in the human form of Jesus wept together. They felt pain. They felt struggle and sorrow. And they felt it in that in-between time. It's okay for us to weep. It's okay for us to be deeply moved on this earthly journey. And more importantly, it's okay for us to be shaken so deeply in our core that it changes the way in which we live. But just like there's sadness and grief and moments of weeping, we know that there's also moments requiring us to work, right? Even though Jesus gave earthly life back to Lazarus, he didn't do it on his own. He gave others work to do. He had a group move the stone away. He told others to unbind him from his linen that he'd been wrapped in. Jesus made a choice to include others. God is like that too, if you think about it. On this journey, God needs and wants human cooperation in accomplishing his purposes here on earth. Just like Jesus, God doesn't have to. God has the power and the ability to do all that on his own. But God chooses us. And God has asked us to love as he loved, to serve as he served, and to lay down our life for others just like he did. It's a very serious calling. It's a very serious honor. We are invited to join in the work of God's redemption here of earth. And that might look like being a listening ear to someone who needs to be able just to talk. Maybe it's rolling away the stone of fear in someone's life. Maybe it's helping undo the binding of painful words, of things that have caused great wounds. We have to remember that we, as humans, don't raise people to life. Jesus Christ does that. But God lets us help. It's a privilege. It gives us a purpose for this earthly journey. And it's a great gift. And we shouldn't take it lightly. So in the in-between times, we know that there are tears. We know that there's work to do. And the last one is this. There is hope. I don't know about you, but I like to hear good news. I sometimes hear a lot of bad news. That just sometimes goes with the job of being pastor. You normally hear more problems than you do good, and that's okay. But I love to hear the good news when I get to hear it. And just like in the beginning of the sermon, we can imagine people around the world experiencing different things at the same time. We can imagine that there are people this week whose lives have been transformed because of a restored relationship, because of a doctor's healing hands, because of a police officer's presence, because someone delivered food to someone in their time of need, someone reunited after a long time of distance. Whenever we experience these moments in our own life or in the life of our family and friends, or even what we see on the news, we need to take joy in that. We need to see its beauty and its goodness and be reminded that it's a taste of what is to come. In the in-between times, God's people live with hope for what is to come. If you think back to John's gospel story that we read today, there were people that believed. There were others in the crowd who gave voice that shared doubt, that gave question that this may not really be real. Who, even despite seeing Lazarus walk out of the tomb, said, "You're not the Messiah." It's a reminder for us in those moments that we strive to have hope. That God's people, including us, right, as God's people, can be ridiculed. We may hear those voices in the crowd that tell us, he's not the Messiah, or this can't be done. But the beauty of this is that God is the one who's walking with us on this journey, in this in-between time. God is the one with us weeping. God is the one with us working. God is the one with us helping us to have hope. And our hope is something we can be reminded of in multiple places in Scripture. The one I want to especially uplift this day from Revelations, the 21st chapter, where we know that Jesus will call to us, come forth from this in-between time to now, and know that in that moment, God will be with us face to face, that our tears will be wiped away, that there'll be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying or pain. We know in that moment that everything is going to be made new, and that we all will have a place with God. We know it's a place that will be full of light. It will be a place where there will be no need, because we'll have all that we can imagine and be fulfilled. But until that day comes, we find ourselves in this in-between, where at any moment, someone is crying and someone is laughing. A moment where someone may be yelling and another person may be offering whispers. A moment where someone's being lifted up and at the same time someone else is being torn down. At any moment in our world, someone is rejoicing. Someone is mourning. Someone is being born and someone is dying. But don't give up on any of those moments. Keep going at any moment. Hang on to that moment if you have to. And try to rejoice in those moments. Because we know that it is at any moment that we will hear God's voice beckon us to that living presence. We know that it's at any moment. Our tears will be wiped away. That our work here on earth will be done. That our hopes will be fully realized. It's at any moment that we will be healed and made whole, and that we will go home. It's at any moment. And in the meantime, as we try to hold on to those moments and live faithfully, know that it's okay for us to cry. And we can work, and we can surely have hope.